If you have no objection, we'll begin the afternoon session. And the first speaker is Marta Faustino, precisely. It is a great pleasure to introduce her, although most of you will certainly know her. We are together organizing this symposium. And as she said at the beginning, at the introduction to the symposium, this idea came from many intense discussions throughout the years. And it is almost impossible for the two of us to meet without discussing this question in one way or the other. What did the ancients think, and how adequate Hadot's and Foucault's interpretation of them are. Marta Faustino is an appointed research fellow at IFILNOV, at Nova Institute of Philosophy, where she coordinates the Art of Living research group in the Culture Lab. She studied sciences of communication and philosophy at the Faculty of Human and Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon, and earned her doctorate in philosophy in 2013 from the same university, with a thesis on Nietzsche's conceptions of great health and therapy. She is currently working on an individual research project on philosophy as a way of life, with a particular focus on Nietzsche, Hadot, and Foucault. She is a member of the Lisbon Nietzsche Group, the Groupe International de Recherche sur Nietzsche, Hyper Nietzsche, Rede Ibero-Americana Foucault, and Melon Philosophy as a Way of Life Network. She is author of several articles and essays on Nietzsche, Hadot, Foucault, and the Hellenistic philosophers, and co-editor of the book Nietzsche e Pessoa, Ensaios, Nietzsche and Pessoa, Essays, from 2016, Rostos do Si, Autobiografia, Confissão, Terapia, Faces of the Self, Autobiography, Confession, Therapy, from 2019, and The Late Foucault, Ethical and Political Questions, from 2020. And today she will present a paper with the title, A Contamination of Philosophy by Religion, Reassessing Hadot's Notion of Spiritual Exercises. So Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hélder. I will try to share a kind of PowerPoint presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, I say a kind of, because, well, what I'm going to present today is neither a paper, because I have no full text yet, and nor a typical PowerPoint presentation, because it probably contains a lot more information than it would be needed. I used this PowerPoint to organize my thoughts. So what you will see is the main points I want to develop in my paper, and I share them with you. I could just as well be reading them, but I share them with you because I feel that perhaps mistakenly that helps you follow my presentation. So my aim in this paper will be to discuss and challenge John Cooper's criticism of Hadot's conception of ancient philosophy as a way of life, and in particular of his notion of spiritual exercises. Cooper develops this criticism in his book Pursuits of Wisdom, 6 Ways of Life in Ancient Philosophy, from Socrates to Plotinus, from 2012. But also in 2 smaller essays. A first one, which he published in 2007, Socrates and Philosophy as a Way of Life, and then also on the tenor lectures he gave also in 2012 on ancient philosophies as ways of life. So my presentation will be in many ways connected to the presentation of Hélder yesterday, and I hope we can keep having our ongoing discussions on this topic. Since I'm not an expert on ancient philosophy, and I take Cooper's criticism to rely, at least to a great extent, on a misreading, and perhaps even recalling Eli's presentation, perhaps even an intentional, creative misreading of Hadot's account, My approach will be essentially internal to both authors' accounts, even though some references to ancient texts will also be made, and for an excellent reply to Cooper's criticism on the basis of ancient philosophy, and especially Stoicism, I refer your attention to the excellent work Matthew Sharpe has been doing. So I will basically try to make sense of what both our authors say about ancient philosophy, and especially concerned to evaluate what Cooper says, Hadot says, about ancient philosophy, try to correct or to make some clarifications on what Hadot actually wants to say about ancient philosophy, and then draw some conclusions from this disputation. So I will start with Cooper's, by describing the main points of Cooper's criticism, then I will go to Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises, and then to the conclusions. So starting with Cooper's criticism. So John Cooper starts his criticism of Hadot's reading of ancient philosophy with an acknowledgement of the way the work of the latter has greatly influenced and inspired his own. And indeed, Cooper shares with Hadot the understanding of ancient philosophy, or at least of a good part of it, as a way of life. And by this expression, Cooper means, just like Hadot, that for most ancient philosophers, philosophy was not merely and purely a subject of study. Philosophers lived their philosophy. And here's a quote from the first essay. A philosopher made philosophy the basis of his whole life. In fact, more even than it meant investigating, discussing, and teaching the subject, being a philosopher for many ancient philosophers meant living one's whole life in a certain way, philosophically, and encouraging others to live that way too. So until here would seem to be no difference between Cooper's reading of ancient philosophy and, but for Hadot, this totalizing and all-encompassing character of philosophy characterized ancient philosophy as a whole, from pre-Platonic philosophers until the rise of Christianity, and it can even be recognized in some modern and contemporary authors who revived important traits of ancient philosophy. For Cooper, by contrast, not every ancient philosopher thought of philosophy in this way, and in fact, this conception of philosophy only applies to six major schools in antiquity, namely the 6 ways of life he analyzes in his book: Platonism, Aristotelianism, Epicureanism, Stoicism, Skepticism, and Neoplatonism. As a consequence, and against Hadot, Cooper argues that the conception of philosophy as a way of life did not exist before Socrates, because pre-Socratic philosophers didn't have any special way of life or thought of their philosophical inquiries or arguments as helping to define or support any such life, and also that the conception of philosophy as a way of life did not survive the antiquity, since post-Renaissance philosophy rejected the fundamental assumptions that made philosophy in antiquity a way of life. So let us look at these assumptions, because it seems that this divergence is based on a different understanding by the two authors, precisely of the way or the reason why philosophy could indeed be a full and complete way of life for its adherents in antiquity. For Hadot, as well known, philosophy was a method of spiritual progress which demanded a radical conversion and transformation of the individual's way of life, way of being, a transformation that was accomplished through the daily and committed practice of what he called spiritual exercises. For Cooper, by contrast, living a philosophical life meant solely and exclusively living according to reason, conceived as a capacity for argument and analysis in pursuit of the truth. It was this fundamental commitment to philosophical reason that granted a philosophical way of life and distinguished it from other ways of living, in particular the religious one. Full knowledge and reasoned understanding of practical truths was enough to move one to action and to grant a life according to those truths. And now I quote a quite illuminating passage by Cooper of what he means and his opposition to Hadot. What was crucial for philosophy as opposed to religion as a way of life all the way through is that what was to keep you going and keep you living your philosophy was nothing more than your fully developed philosophical, reasoned understanding of what you thought was a truth about human beings and their place in the world. You did not need spiritual uplift and purification, and it would indeed be a serious distraction in most of the ancient philosophical lives. It is that sort of life, one growing out of and deriving from exercises of philosophical reason, that I have emphasized in his lecture. This is the Tanner lectures. In fact, no quasi-religious devotional practices, such as Hadot describes, had or even could have had anything essential to do with living a life of philosophy, given what itself, both in antiquity and in fact in its whole history, is an exercise of reason. So Cooper develops three main arguments against Hadot's conception of ancient philosophy as a practice involving spiritual exercises as a crucial part of it. First, Cooper argues that this is a conception derived from and contaminated by religious notions, and as such, it unaccurately blurs the distinction between the philosophical and the religious ways of life. According to Cooper, the very motivation of Hadot's work was, he says, his interest in what he saw as ways in which the ancient philosophies resembled religions. And the very term spiritual exercises, Cooper claims, was taken from St. Ignatius of Loyola's Exercitia Spiritualia. The second claim, or the second point of the criticism Cooper makes, is that spiritual exercises can only be found in late Hellenistic philosophies, which indeed started borrowing exercises from Christian spirituality and are, for that reason, declining versions of ancient philosophy. And Hadot unfairly reads them back onto the whole tradition. Thirdly, and finally, it omits virtually altogether the central and indispensable place in philosophy and in Greece and ever since of rigorous analysis and reasoned argumentation. And the result, Cooper argues, is a badly distorted account of what ancient philosophy was and of how, unlike most of philosophy over its long history since the end of antiquity, the ancient philosophies managed to be ways of life for their adherents. Okay, so this is Cooper in a nutshell, or Cooper's criticism in a nutshell, and I would now like to address each of these points in turn through a clarification of what I take Hadot to mean with his notion of spiritual exercises. So first, this idea of the contamination of Hadot's account. Despite Hadot's religious background, which is well known, there is no evidence in his works that his major interest in ancient philosophies was the fact that he saw them as resembling religions, as Cooper says. On the contrary, Hadot dates the origins of his interest in philosophy back to an experience that was, he says, entirely foreign to Christianity, even though this could and has been contested, but that's the way he describes his experience, as being entirely foreign to Christianity, and that Christian spirituality could not attend to, given its bond to everyday banality. And Hadot describes this experience as a sentiment of strangeness, astonishment, and wonder before the world that corresponded to questions such as, what am I? Why am I here? What is this world I am in? Hadot classified this experience as a deeply philosophical one, as in his own understanding, admittedly different from Cooper's, philosophy means precisely this awareness of existence, of being in the world, and consists essentially in a transformation of one's perception of the world. For Hadot, this consciousness of the world and of our existence in it characterizes the philosopher, the authentic existence, and sets him apart from all the others immersed in everyday life and social convention, in which he includes the Christians. Philosophy differs from religion also insofar as the latter relies on faith, prayer, grace, and obedience to an external authority, God, while the former presupposes a life led in accordance with reason. And I could also refer to his essay on conversion, where it is very clear the difference between the philosophical and the religious conversion. I'm not going there now. Cooper seems to take also for granted that Hadot took the term spiritual exercises from St. Ignatius, and it is also on this basis that he understands Hadot's notion. But Hadot is explicitly denied this influence or any other religious roots of the expression, and explains his choice of the term despite the religious connotations of which he was well aware of. And this information is in the interview Philosophical Discourse as Spiritual Exercise. So first of all, he explains that he was struck by the title of a special number of the journal Fontaine entitled Poetry, a Spiritual Exercise, La Poésie comme exercice spirituel, and also by the fact that he learned in a biography, if I'm not mistaken, that Beethoven referred to pedagogical exercises of musical composition as spiritual exercises. So the roots of the expression, if you want to go that far, are more aesthetical than religious. It was in the realm of aesthetics that he found the term spiritual exercises and found it compelling. Then secondly, he found Paul Rabel's demonstration in Seelenführung, Methodiek der Exercitien in der Antike, that St. Ignatius' spiritual exercises were inherited from ancient thought and had thus a philosophical origin compelling. And so this is a thesis that he endorses and defends throughout his works in Rabel's wake. It is not original from Hadot to defend this continuity between St. Ignatius and the spiritual exercises we find in antiquity. And thirdly, says that he resisted the expression precisely because of its possible religious connotations and tried several alternatives, but he nevertheless decided to keep it because none of the alternatives seemed fitting. And here's a quote from the same interview. Why did I choose it, the expression spiritual exercises, and why can I say that it was not because of its possible religious connotations? And then he refers to this, he makes this reference that I have just made, how he came to the expression spiritual exercises. And then he continues, I nevertheless attempted to avoid words and I tried everything that one could say instead. Moral exercises was not good because they were not only exercises of a moral order. Ethical exercises did not work either, and intellectual exercises did not cover everything that is represented by the notion of spiritual exercises. Thus, I have resigned myself to employ the expression spiritual exercises, and all things considered, this is quite standard. The notion has been employed frequently and for a long time to designate the voluntary practices I have discussed. Finally, the expression spiritual exercises does not fool anyone. People, philosophers, historians have used it without thinking of either religion or St. Ignatius. He was mistaken, clearly. So in his essay entitled Spiritual Exercises, Hadot adds some expressions that he unsuccessfully tried as alternatives to spiritual exercises, psychic, moral, ethical, intellectual, of thought, of the soul, and adds further clarification on why none of them was appropriate. Thought exercises or intellectual exercises were not appropriate because, sorry, even though the object of spiritual exercises is thought, which seeks to modify itself, and intellectual factors such as definition, division, raciocination, reading, investigation, etc., play a large role in them. These expressions seem to neglect the role and importance of imagination and sensibility in these exercises. Then moral exercises or ethical exercises, which is the expression that Rabel uses, also didn't seem appropriate because even though spiritual exercises contribute to the therapeutics of the passions and have an impact in one's behavior and the conduct of life, they are not exclusively from a moral or ethical order, but rather imply one's entire psychism and vision of the world. So in short, none of the alternatives seemed fitting because none of them was broad and encompassing enough to imply that the transformation these exercises produce is a radical transfiguration not only of a particular moral or cognitive trace of individuals, but of their entire characters and inner selves and of their lives accordingly. So there was this dimension of spiritual exercise involving one's entire psychism, entire character, entire selves. That was the core of Hadot's notion of spiritual. And here I have three quotes. The first one is from the same interview on philosophical discourse, a spiritual exercise. Spiritual exercises are voluntary personal practices meant to bring about a transformation of the individual, a transformation of the self. Then in the essay Spiritual Exercises in the volume Philosophy as a Way of Life, philosophy is a concrete attitude and determinate lifestyle which engages the whole of existence. The philosophical act is not situated merely on the cognitive level, but on that of the self and of being. It is a progress which causes us to be more fully and makes us better. The object of spiritual exercises is precisely to bring about this transformation. Little by little, they make possible the indispensable metamorphosis of our inner self. And then finally, from an essay contained in the selected writings, Ancient Philosophy and Ethics or Practice, the ancients considered philosophy as a choice which committed a person's entire life and soul. This is why the exercise of philosophy was not solely intellectual, but could also be spiritual. So here Hadot is clearly using, contrasting spiritual to intellectual, implying that intellectual is only a part of one being, and that the spiritual exercise or philosophy is a way of life intending the transfiguration of one's whole self. So Hadot associates spiritual exercises to a constellation of terms which allows us to understand better his own understanding of the expression, and especially how it is, well, we had something a lot broader meaning in mind than what Cooper accused him of. So first of all, there is paideia. The goal of spiritual exercises is self-formation, intended to teach us how to live in conformity, not with social convention, but with human nature, which is reason. Then there is gymnasium. Spiritual exercises are a kind of training of the mind, just as one might strengthen and modify the body through physical exercises. Through spiritual exercises, one can strengthen the soul, modify one's inner climate and worldview, and hence one's entire being and way of living. Thirdly, ascesis, which is a very important term because Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises basically seems to correspond to the Greek notion of ascesis as exercise or training and self-discipline, a work of the self on the self-transformation in order to attain a certain ideal state or endpoint. Finally, of course, Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises is also deeply connected to his conception of philosophy as technical bio, an art of living. So ancient philosophers saw philosophy as an art of living, and just like any other art in the sense of craft or technique, this is a type of knowledge that must not only be theoretically apprehended, but practically applied, trained, exercised. For the ancients, doing philosophy meant practicing how to live, that is, exercising oneself in the art of living. And then I have here, I try to compose this chart with a classification of Hadot's spiritual exercises. This is far from complete, and my idea is not to focus in the particular exercises, but just to point to the great multiplicity and diversity of practices that Hadot considered spiritual exercises. And I'm interested precisely in the classification that he offers of these exercises. There are, on the one hand, thought or mind exercises, which are meant to produce a transformation in thought and control inner discourse, that is, change one's worldview. And these exercises include attention, meditation, memorization, morning and evening meditation, praemeditatio malorum in the case of the Stoics, mental concentration, a lot of them. Then we have intellectual exercise, Hadot defines as meant to provide nourishment for the other exercises. And here, Hadot includes dialogue, dialectic, reading, listening, research, but also definition, division, argumentation, also probably the only ones which Cooper would accept, ones that would be more closer to the idea of exercises of reason. And then there are the practical or active exercises, which consist in the application of fundamental rules intended to create habits like self-mastery, accomplishment of duties in the case of the Stoics, therapy of the passions or limitation of desires in the case of Deans, or even more strictly ascetic practices in the case of the Cynics. And then I added here also the literary genres in which these exercises were conveyed, because they also play an important role in Hadot, and I will come to that later. I would just like to point to the big diversity of genres we find in antiquity, which were not at all reduced to the treatise. We find also letters, maxims, aphorisms, consolations, exhortations, hypomnemata, meditations, manual discourses, and so on. Okay, so let me just check the time. I hope I want 10 minutes. Is that okay, Hélder?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I will make it. Sorry. So let us now draw some conclusions from this. This chart and the previous clarifications help me to make the following points against Cooper's criticism of Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises. First of all, as I have already implied, Hadot's notion is evidently broader than Cooper implies, and far from restricted to those quasi-religious devotional practices to which Cooper reduces Hadot's account of ancient philosophy as a whole. I think this is, even though I admit that the term spiritual might be ambiguous, I think Hadot is very clear when he explains what he means by spiritual exercises, and I really don't know if Cooper really didn't get it or didn't want to get what Hadot was pointing to, because reducing them to these quasi-religious devotional practices is just a brutish misreading of what Hadot is saying, it seems to me. So understood in this broader sense as essentially ascesis, it is difficult to contest its presence, at least of some version of them, long before Hellenistic philosophies, even if they are indeed intensified and diversified in the Hellenistic period, as Hadot readily recognizes. And finally, Hadot's long list of spiritual exercises explicitly includes those intellectual exercises of reason, such as rational argumentation and logical analysis in pursuit of the truth, which Cooper sees as the essence of ancient philosophy and indeed philosophy itself, even if he does not restrict them to these and does not rank them so highly as Cooper does. So let us see each of these points in turn. First, the broadness of Hadot's conception of spiritual exercises. Contrary to Cooper's claims, Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises includes all kinds of philosophical exercises, indeed involving all faculties of the individual and not just reason or the intellect, that are designed to facilitate the transition or conversion to a philosophical perspective and the continuous translation of theory into lived practice. In fact, Hadot's emphasis on spiritual exercises as the core of philosophical practice in antiquity stresses both the potentiality of philosophy to transform individuals and their ways of living and the difficulty of doing it. Cooper seems to strangely neglect the possibility that, no matter how rigorously grounded in rational arguments and proofs, and no matter how persuaded the individual might be of their truth, philosophy might still remain innocuous as to the actual character and way of life of individuals. This is the core of Hadot's fundamental distinction between philosophy and philosophical discourse, but also between notional and real assent, which is a distinction he takes from the grammar of assent from Cardinal John Henry Newman. So while notional assent is a purely intellectual acceptance of a theoretical proposition to which one adheres in an abstract way, and the best example of this would be a mathematical truth like 2 + 2 = 4, real accent implies the adherence to a proposition, the acceptance of which commits one's entire being and changes one's way of life, which is the type of assent which is implied in philosophy as a way of life, of course. So spiritual exercises are precisely the practices as part of an ongoing training in incorporation of and habituation to a certain philosophy that allow a notional assent to become a real assent. They are designed to reinforce the persuasive force of previously acquired truths, dogmas, and grant their continuous translation into practice. That is, they grant that knowledge is assimilated and internalized, made perfectly familiar and connatural, that those dogmas become nature and life within us, to use an expression that Hadot takes from Porphyry. In Cooper's own formulation, this is curious, they are ways of getting oneself to understand the real meaning and implications of philosophical arguments and philosophical positions, to fix them in one's mind and make oneself ready to apply them smoothly to situations as they may arise. So this is a footnote that we find in Pursuits of Wisdom, where Cooper does indeed seem to come very close to what Hadot had in mind. And even though Cooper acknowledges that this intellectual training required to live philosophically is an important part of ancient philosophy, he insists that there is nothing at all spiritual in Hadot's sense of the term about them, because they have no affinity with St. Ignatius' meditations on sin and on the Passion of Christ. Now, since Hadot would, at least partially, because he does see the continuity, since Hadot would agree with his last claim, it seems fair to conclude that Cooper's divergence from Hadot in this respect is based on a preconceptuous misreading of his account, and is thus more terminological than philosophical or even hermeneutical in nature. And here I refer to John Seller's review of Cooper's Pursuits of Wisdom, which defends a similar thesis to mine. It is, after all, Cooper that reads Hadot's account of spiritual exercise on the basis of St. Ignatius, and not Hadot who reads ancient philosophy on the basis of Ignatius' notion. So that some kind of training, exercise, and or habituation is required in order to lead a philosophical life is amply confirmed by all the major philosophers in antiquity. And here I have some just very random and perhaps obvious examples. I need to work this better for my paper, but I just wanted to point out that training or exercise, habituation, is more or less stressed by all philosophers in antiquity. We have Plato's definition of philosophy as a training for death in Phaedo. We have Aristotle's insistence on training and habituation for the attainment of excellence, and his definition actually as a habit, not an act, in Nicomachean Ethics. We have Epicurus' exhortation at the end of his letter to Minucius: meditate therefore on these things and things akin to them night and day by yourself and with a companion like to yourself. Or Epictetus in his discourses: these are the thoughts that those who pursue philosophy should ponder. These are the lessons they should write down day by day. In these they should exercise themselves. Diogenes' ascetic practices like rolling over hot sand or embracing statues covered with snow as a means of inuring himself to hardship, as Diogenes Laertius tells us. Or even Porphyry's claim that the contemplation that produces happiness does not consist in the accumulation of discourse and abstract teachings, but rather these studies must be accompanied by an effort to make these teachings become nature and life within us. This is a quote, it's a passage that Hadot quotes, and that I left here in Chase's translation, because I find very illuminating of what I want to claim. So whether this training is spiritual or not, of course, depends on how one understands the term. And once we get rid of what I call Cooper's preconception and accept Hadot's description of spiritual exercises as equivalent to ascesis, being spiritual because they imply a transfiguration of perception that involves one's entire psychism and inner self, then it's not difficult to find instances of them not only in pre-Hellenistic philosophy, but even in modern and contemporary philosophers. Under this broad understanding, even seemingly exclusively intellectual activities such as Plato's dialogues, dialectic disputation of arguments, etc., are conceived as spiritual exercises insofar as they take place not as a mere theoretical and abstract exhibition, but in a specific form, so as to produce what Hadot calls an effect of formation in the interlocutor. That's the aim. So they acquire different forms in each one of the schools and are meant not only to make the interlocutor think, argue, speak well, but also to make him, her judge, act, live better. That's Hadot's claim. Relatedly, one of the major motivations for Hadot's conception of spiritual exercises has been the literary genres we find in ancient philosophy, that is, the ways in which philosophy is conveyed. If what was at stake in ancient philosophy was merely the exposition of rational arguments, or if, as Cooper claims, if this exposition was considered enough to produce a change in one's life, then the choice of literary genres in antiquity is just ununderstandable. If one does not contextualize them within this particular purpose of formation, ancient texts will necessarily seem weak, incoherent, inconsistent, contradictory, and so on. So finally, not only does Hadot not omit the role of intellectual exercises, or in general, the place of rigorous analysis and reasoned argumentation in ancient philosophy, but he even stresses their cardinal importance in several of his essays, though perhaps few, and I refer here particularly to the essay contained in the selected writings, Philosophy, Dialectic, and Rhetoric in Antiquity, where he stresses just how important was dialectic and how it was differently used by the different schools according to their aims or pedagogic strategy. It is important to stress that theory is the very basis of one's way of life, and strictly intellectual exercises such as study, reading, research, discussion, rational argumentation, and disputation are the nourishment, as Hadot says, of thought, mind, exercises. In this sense, Hadot's conception of philosophy presupposes the existence of a highly systematic theoretical discourse, which is itself a crucial part of philosophy and plays a vital role in the philosophical life. But this discourse must, of course, be internalized. It must become inner discourse if it is to give form to one's way of life. And that's the aim of spiritual exercise. For this reason, Hadot does insist that theory or philosophical discourse was only one element of philosophical activity, which was intended to ground the particular way of life and spiritual exercises of each philosophy, but they were indeed not an end in themselves. Fundamental was the practice of this theory, the effort to translate it at each instant in each action and behavior in one's way of life. And there is this quote, also in ancient philosophy and ethics or practice, philosophy is above all a mode of life which includes a certain mode of discourse as one of its integral parts without being reduced to it. Now I'm almost jumping to the conclusion. The main point of divergence actually between Hadot and Cooper seems to lie not directly in their interpretations of ancient philosophy, but rather in their different meta-philosophies, which obviously also have an impact on the way they read ancient philosophy. One can argue with Cooper that spiritual exercises without theory and rational argumentation is not philosophy, and does read ancient philosophies exclusively on the basis of their theories, doctrines, and arguments. But we can also argue with Hadot that theory and rational argumentation without spiritual practice and transformation is not philosophy either, and does read ancient philosophy stressing precisely the spiritual exercises of each school. The difference here is that while Hadot would agree with Cooper's premise, Cooper entirely rejects Hadot's. And so Hadot's emphasis on spiritual exercises and self-transformation and his apparent neglect of the role of theory and rational argumentation seems to be, at least to some extent, motivated by the wish to challenge precisely dominant Cooper-like conceptions of philosophy in the context of which these elements are already established and need not to be reaffirmed as important components of philosophy. And here I'm completely sympathetic, or I totally agree with Larivée's thesis yesterday that the conception of philosophy as a way of life contains a meta-philosophical claim, and there is some intention of reform of current conceptions of philosophy, and that it only makes sense in contrast or as opposed to other possible conceptions of philosophy, namely the predominant ones, perhaps. So one might even thus perhaps assume that Hadot himself has made a performative use of language and even some rhetoric strategies like omission, exaggeration, and so on, in order to provoke a change in the way we perceive ancient philosophy and thereby also eventually transform the way we conceive and practice it today. So now really the conclusion, to come back to the beginning of the paper, I want to claim that there is a sense in which Hadot did indeed see ancient philosophies as resembling religions in the way they involved a disruptive break with common ways of living and an absolute and totalizing commitment, indeed conversion, to a radically new way of life. But this is in principle a claim that Cooper would not contest. But Hadot has also stressed the way in which philosophy was radically opposed to the religious as well as the ordinary way of life. The philosophical way of life implies an existential choice and commitment to live not on the basis of social convention, not according to one's egoistic point of view, not in obedience to or reliance on some external and or transcendent authority, in this case, God. The philosopher commits to living a life in accordance to human nature, which is reason, adopting a cosmic perspective and dedicating it to the constant actualization and perfection of his or her harmony with universal reason, logos, in the pursuit of wisdom, Sophia. The imperfect condition of the philosopher implies that this is essentially a life of training and exercitation, ascesis, and progressive self-transformation, or in Hadot's formulation, spiritual progress, towards a state one can never be certain of ever achieving. And this is the essence of philosophy. This is, I believe, also the core of Hadot's reading of ancient philosophy, which Cooper seems to have, perhaps intentionally, neglected. Thank you. And sorry for speaking so long. I think the organizers will kill me.
Thank you very much, Marta, for this well-informed and, at least for me, very provocative defense of Hadot's view of ancient philosophy. And we have around 15 minutes for discussion. So are there any questions? Federico, Michael, and Paulo Lima, Gianfranco. Okay, so if the four of you could ask your question, then if Marta could reply to them, it would be great. Federico, you may start.
I just want to thank you, Marta, for this amazing, very, very well organized and informative presentation. I really liked the way you responded to Cooper. I really liked the procedure you used, so that presentation of the different kinds, those categories of spiritual exercises. I thought it was very, very informative and good, and I look forward to using that in my work. Now, in terms of the content, I have a few actually comments more than questions. So the first one, I think you mentioned it, but it's a question that it's very important for me. Whether there is a religious aspect in Hadot's approach, I agree with you completely, but I think there's also something that's maybe not religious but mystical, at least in the account of his conversion to philosophy. Those references to the world, to the presence of the world, the references to the sentiments océaniques, Romain Rolland, and the ideas of a mystique sauvage. And he even quotes in the interviews with Arnold Davidson and Jenny Carlier that book by Michel Loulin, which I mentioned in my own work. So I think there's one thing is Hadot's own sort of account of his own conversion to philosophy on the one hand, and on the other, his approach to philosophy as a way of life. I think there are moments in which they converge, and there are concepts that he uses that you can see the echoes of that fundamental experience that he narrates in the interviews. For instance, the conscience cosmique and the belonging to the world, etc. But I think that in addition to the great sort of archaeology you presented of these religious, non-religious sources of the notion of spiritual exercises, I would just like to remind us of the way he phrases it in the text that isn't the book, in the selected writings, but also reappears in the book on Wittgenstein. Because basically a lot of what he's saying that the role of spiritual exercises are in his approach to philosophy is to account for the particular language games in which philosophical discourses emerge, right? And also I think that's also a way out of Cooper's criticism, because here he even says very explicitly, by explaining, he traces back the origin of this notion of spiritual exercise to his encounter with the work of Wittgenstein. So that would be a way in which, the contradictions and inconsistencies of ancient texts would somehow be solved or make sense in the context of their own language games, which are determined by, or in the context of which the spiritual exercise emerge. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thanks again for the presentation.
Thank you, Federico. Michael, your turn, please.
Yes, I echo everything Federico said. I think it's a wonderful presentation, so I really don't have anything positive to ask. I just wanted to ask you about one little sentence that you included near the end of your presentation, Marta, in which you said that theory is the basis of one's way of life. I wonder if that's really Hadot's position. That's all I had to say.
Thank you. Paulo?
Sorry, I think I'm experiencing some troubles because I couldn't hear Michael until the end, and then your voice
Oh, okay.
more bright. I think probably it's my connection. Sorry, but I think I got your point. So you wonder if the idea that theory is the basis of one's way of life is really the Hadot's notion?
Yes.
But
Is that really Hadot's position?
Do you want to contest it in a more specific way?
Oh, well, I do contest it. I don't think that's Hadot's position. I don't believe that he said. I don't believe that he says that theory is at the basis of one's way of life. On the contrary, he often implies that it's an epiphenomenon.
Proceed, Marta. The question.
Aren't we gathering? Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, Paulo, your question.
My turn. Thanks very much, Marta. I also echo what the other speakers just said. But your presentation is really interesting and clear, and I totally agree with your. And I mean, it was amazing the way you refuted Cooper's position and interpretation of Hadot. So, but I have a question, which regards your classification of the different types of spiritual exercises. And my question is, do all of them involve a unity or an already established unity between notional and real assent? Because I ask this because if some of them only involve persuading oneself of the validity of a certain conception, certain arguments, this would mean that there are specific exercises that do not involve real assent, in my opinion. So I wonder what you have to say about this. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paulo. And Gianfranco, to close off this first round of questions.
Marta, thank you very much for your presentation. As you know, I agree at all with your interpretation also of Cooper's position. Just a remark about Saint Ignace, and the question if the spiritual exercises are or not connected with Saint Ignace. I think that the main question in this case is a sort of a semantic transition that also Saint Ignace operates himself. That is the fact that Saint Ignace reads, as we know, the ancient Stoic and the ancient writers and philosophers. So, and he interprets his religious attempt precisely as a gymnastic. So we can refer against Cooper also this fact that the religious position of Saint Ignace is in part connected with the ancient practices. And just a last thing, we can maybe interpret the Cooper's position as also a confusion between spirituality and religion, that are not the same things for Hadot, and maybe Hadot is not so clear in defining what spirituality is different from religion.
Thank you, Gianfranco. Marta?
I think there's another person who wants to ask a question. I don't know if.
Oh,
okay, maybe we gather it then, and I.
Yes.
Well, I'm really happy to gather. I'm more concerned in getting feedback than replying. So if you allow me not to reply fully, I prefer to hear feedback then.
Okay, in that case, Katie, do you also want to make a question?
Yes, I do have a question.
Please.
Marta, in your opinion, what positions do the gods hold in Hadot's thought? And this might speak to the confusion of spirituality and religion, but I'm thinking of Lucretius and how he said, well, they're baby gods, but if they are, they're very remote and they don't have much to do with us. So I wondered about Hadot's position on how the gods related to spiritual exercises.
Thank you. So, Marta.
Okay, thank you first, Federico, when you say that there is not necessarily a religious aspect in Hadot's conversion, but there is certainly a mystical one. I totally agree. This at least the way he phrases this fundamental experience of his existence, this oceanic feeling certainly has a mystical connotation, and he does refer to it several times. What I think is that this mystical experience does not determine a religious conversion or a philosophical conversion. It's quite neutral. Basically, the questions with which he characterizes these experiences, what am I, what is the world I'm in, what am I doing here, are, so to say, the experience that allows you to convert either to religion or to philosophy. Just the answers and your path will be difficult, and I think it's clear that in the end he makes a unquestionable philosophical decision or conversion. So regarding the language games, you're also totally right, and thank you for bringing that to my attention. That's actually why in the same chart where I try to classify the spiritual exercises, I also brought together the literary genres, because it's true that Hadot saw spiritual exercises as particular language games. They take place according to different language games, and the influence of Wittgenstein, for sure, to recall that is certainly an extra argument against Cooper, because there is also this strong philosophical influence on his account of the spiritual exercises. I didn't refer to Wittgenstein when I was when I somehow listed the origins of spiritual exercise, because I was just trying to refer to the expression spiritual exercises. Because I wanted to claim that Hadot just uses Saint Ignatius' expression, and I wanted to contest that with Hadot's own a reconstruction of the process, which led him to conceive of or call spiritual exercises spiritual exercises. That's why I didn't refer Wittgenstein as an influence, because Wittgenstein doesn't use the expression spiritual exercises, but for sure has been one of the main influences, or Hadot's conception of this kind of exercises in ancient philosophy. And then Michael says that I said that theory is the basis of one's way of life. I'm really sorry if that does not completely correspond to Hadot says. Maybe I'm not sure if I took this literally from Hadot, or this was just my interpretation or misreading of what he was saying. I need to look that closer. It probably never refers to it. You know that a lot better than I do, because I basically in your words. So, but what I meant was just to point out to this that is quite banal. I think that there is no practice in this. There is no, even though Hadot stresses so much these practices, these exercises, this process of self-transformation. This doesn't mean that there is no theory lying behind it. That's that if you have the way of life you lead is grounded somehow in perhaps what Cooper calls this reasoned understanding of truth. It's because I adhere to a certain system, to a certain system that I deem to be truth, that I lead the way of life I lead. I just wanted to point out that there's no practice without theory, and that this practice is also not arbitrary. I live my life in a certain way because I believe that's the right way, the true way of living. Right? So I just wanted to point out that the way of life could not be disconnected from theory, and so from discourse. But maybe I have expressed me in the wrong way.
No, if I just briefly follow up, no, the problem is clearly he states again and again that discourse and theory are both incommensurable and inseparable. But to say that theory is the basis clearly ascribes the primacy to one of those two elements, and that's disputable, I think, because with the choice that one makes to belong to a philosophical school is an existential choice. It's not theory. And then once one is in, there are passages, as you know, where Hadot says theories, if we're talking about theoretical discourses, theories about metaphysics and physics and so forth, are in a certain extent invented after the fact to justify the practice of a specific kind of life.
Okay, thank you. Now I got your point. I will be careful to formulate that in a more accurate way in my paper. Regarding Paulo Lima's commentary, it's interesting if all the exercises involve an already established unity between notional and real assent. Actually, I don't know if I completely understood you, but I think they even imply that that this unity is not established yet. I mean, in principle, if it was completely established yet, you wouldn't need some of the exercises. The exercises exist precisely to make a notional assent become real assent. That is, that your full understanding of a certain proposition or dogma, truth, is not just abstract, but is internalized, is incorporated, is turned into your life, your practice. That's what a real assent means, that beyond your rational grasp of it, you also live according to it. So spiritual exercises, as I understand them are intended to produce this transition. So they somehow imply precisely contrary, that there is no unity yet. Does this make
Yes,
sense to you, or was not the
probably
point of your question?
Probably I didn't express myself very, very clearly. Perhaps the unity, it's not necessary that the unity is already established, but that as far as I understood your conception of spiritual exercises following Hadot's, that a spiritual exercise is somehow responsible for linking these two poles, the notional assent and the real assent. But if you classify them according to a division in which at least one category is dedicated to to self-persuasion of the validity of an argument, you're somehow breaking this unity, because you're locating one of the categories on the side of what is simply a notional assent. I don't know if I'm.
Well, if you mean rational persuasion, then that would be the end, the aim of the strictly intellectual exercises, which then are the nourishment, as Hadot says, of the thought and mind exercises, which would probably be the most, or where most of the ancient spiritual exercises that Hadot lists are included. So the point is that precisely this rational persuasion is not enough. Sometimes some even non-discursive practices might be needed to make a notional assent a real assent. So that you might.
Yeah, of course, Marta. I totally agree with you. But I mean, but I wonder if this division is in a way a bit artificial, in the sense that it.
Yeah, maybe it is, but that's my fault. I tried to.
No, but I mean, it's very useful, and it shows that you've worked very hard on the texts, and it's surely very useful. But I think it's even more useful if we are aware that this link between the
I'm not hearing you. I don't know if it's my.
Yeah.
Sorry, I stopped hearing you. I don't know if it's my
probably
connection or everybody's problem.
I'm hearing fine.
So sorry, I couldn't hear Paulo at the
Yeah,
moment.
but I'm satisfied with your answer. So let's move on.
No, thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Personally about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have the chance
That way
to.
we won't bother the other participants.
And we are running
Thanks, Marta.
out of time, right? Hélder?
We ran
So,
out of time, yes.
Thank you.
So if you could be brief,
Sorry.
The last two replies, be great.
I thank also Gianfranco for his note on the way St. Ignatius himself expresses the influence of ancient philosophers in the way he interprets his own exercises. I'm not sure this would work as a criticism of Cooper. This would reinforce another theory of Hadot, which is that St. Ignatius exercises should be inscribed in this long tradition of exercises. But it does not work necessarily against Cooper, because the fact that St. Ignatius felt influenced by the practices in antiquity doesn't necessarily mean that what we find in antiquity are spiritual practices, which is what Hadot claims and Cooper contests. And I totally agree also with a certain confusion between spirituality and religion. I must say that these terms are also not clear for anybody, I think, or at least spirituality. I'm not sure of what spirituality is. I can try to make sense of what Hadot says about spiritual exercises, because he describes it at length, or of what Foucault says about spirituality in ancient philosophy. But if you ask me what is spirituality by itself, probably I can't answer on my own. And I think that these authors probably can be blamed, as you said, even though I think Hadot does make a lot of effort to clarify what he means. if we are to talk about spirituality or spiritual anything, it's good that we explain what we are talking about, because the terms are not obvious at all. But I think, I must say, I think here Cooper is more to blame than Hadot, because as I said, Hadot tried to explain what he meant by spiritual exercises, and I feel that Cooper just didn't try, or didn't make efforts enough to understand what he was meaning. He just took this term spiritual exercise, he assumed a certain meaning and charged Hadot with that meaning. So his criticism is somehow on a weak basis, I feel like. I mean, I'm not contesting the incredible knowledge he must have on ancient philosophy, which I, of course, don't. I'm not contesting his work on ancient philosophy. I'm contesting his work on the work of Hadot, because it's even a bit, because he presents his pursuits of wisdom as being deeply influenced by Hadot's conception. So how can you write on such a strong conception or under the influence of a certain author without giving it full attention and trying to understand exactly what he says before writing your own work, challenging what the other said without really understanding it fully. So I really find Cooper's position quite awkward, I must say. And regarding the last question, I mean, I thank you for the question. Of course, I don't think I'm the best person to speak about or at length about Hadot's relation to the gods, and we don't really have time for that. I believe that Michael Chase will also touch this topic later, and maybe he will be able to give you a more accurate answer than I could. I don't know if I'm doing wrong promises or promising what I can't, but I'm just worried also as organizer also about the time. So I don't know, maybe we can, I really thank you all for your attention and patience and commentaries. It really helped me a lot, and I will keep thinking on this, and thank you.
Thank you, Marta.